Social and ideological conflicts of the 1920s. The Roaring Twenties were a time of conflict over values. Communism was perceived as a direct and imminent threat to the free enterprise system and American values. At the same time, nativists were clashing with immigrants and minorities, and the adoption of new cultural values was threatening tradition, conventions, and morals. The Red Scare. In 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia, abolishing private property, freedom of religion, and free enterprise. President Wilson authorized American intervention to fight the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War. American troops stayed in Siberia until 1920, but were unable to stop the communist takeover. In Germany and Hungary, communists were also threatening to seize power. Back in the US, with the war over, many workers worried about their future and began a series of strikes that received lots of attention, like the police strike in Boston or the general strike in Seattle. With the ongoing surge of strikes throughout the country and the threats of communism in Central Europe, Americans became fearful of a communist revolution at home in a wave of fear and suspicion known as the Red Scare. During this time, Italian-born anarchists began sending letter bombs in the mail. Bombs exploded throughout the country. One of them, addressed to Attorney General Mitchell Palmer, exploded in his porch. Palmer created the Radical Division, an intelligence group under the Justice Department, headed by J. Edgar Hoover. In January 1920, Hoover directed simultaneous raids in 30 cities, arresting more than 6,000 suspects, most of them immigrants from Russia and Germany. These raids became known as the Palmer Raids. Most of the arrested were deported back to their countries without a trial, including political activist Emma Goldman. The Red Scare weakened labor unions and increased nativist feelings. SACCO and VANZETTI. The bias against immigrants, socialists, and anarchists was evident in the criminal case of SACCO and VANZETTI. In 1920, Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were arrested for murders committed during a payroll truck robbery. Sacco and Vanzetti were declared guilty and sentenced to death, even though the evidence was unconvincing and unclear. The judge had been biased, and requests for retrial were denied, despite new evidence. Sacco and Vanzetti were executed in 1927. There was an international outcry, and a general agreement that the trial had been unfair. Immigration restrictions. With the nativist sentiment growing, and the increasing prejudice against Southern and Eastern Europeans and their political ideas, Americans began to favor restrictions on immigration. Harding promised to limit immigration, and Congress concurred by passing the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. This law introduced quotas, or fixed numbers of people who could legally immigrate to the United States. The total number of immigrants allowed for that year was 350,000, less than half of the number admitted the year before. Each country was assigned a quota, or maximum number of immigrants that could be accepted. The purpose of the law was to avoid changes in the ethnic composition of the United States by reducing the number of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Immigration from Asia had been banned in 1917, except for the Philippines, which was still an American territory. Immigration from Latin America remained unrestricted. Coolidge sought to further tighten immigration restrictions. Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1924, or the National Origins Act, which reduced the number of immigrants to 150,000 and changed the quotas to reduce even further the number of Southern and Eastern Europeans admitted to the United States. The rebirth of the Klan. During the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan was reborn, organizing on a national level and reaching in a few years a large, solid membership, even greater than the membership numbers attained during Reconstruction. The movie, The Birth of a Nation, had glorified the Klan's early history and served as propaganda for recruiting members. The Klan's ideology expanded, and not only included the traditional racism against African Americans, but also hatreds for Catholics, Jews, immigrants, union members, and women advocating voting rights. The Klan had the vision of a traditional Anglo-Saxon male-dominated society and claimed to represent 100% Americanism. Its membership was especially high in the South and the Midwest. Politically, they supported the Democratic Party, and some Klan members were even elected to office. Traditional versus new values. By the 1920s, Americans were mostly urban, had greater mobility, and enjoyed the comforts of electricity, the automobile, and other inventions. Many Americans embraced modernity with a new sense of freedom and power, while others sought to preserve traditional values. As a result, the decade would be an ideological and generational battle over values. Prohibition. Protestant churches and women were already active in the temperance movement, which sought to ban alcohol as the root of poverty, crime, sin, and the breakdown of families. During the 19th century, many state governments had adopted prohibition, and by 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, or transport of intoxicating liquors. Congress had to pass the Volstead Act to include beer and wine in the definition of intoxicating liquors, and allow exceptions for the production of alcohol for medical and religious use. Since there were only a few enforcing agents, and the language of the 18th Amendment didn't prohibit consumption, prohibition proved difficult to enforce. Speakeasies, or clandestine illegal nightclubs, began to open in major cities, serving alcohol in secret. Bootleggers brought beer and whiskey from Canada, while some others made their own homemade brews. Americans lost respect for the law, and soon organized crime took over the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcohol. Criminal bosses like Al Capone in Chicago extended their illegal business to include gambling, prostitution, and even using intimidation and violence to collect money from businesses. Prohibition was a failure, and in 1933 was repealed with the ratification of the 21st Amendment. Christian fundamentalism and the Scopes trial. Some Christian churches attempted to keep their faith unchanged and declared their beliefs in the fundamentals, a 12-volume study published between 1905 and 1910. Christian fundamentalists believed the Bible to be a literal account of the events of creation, which clearly opposed Darwin's theory of evolution and the process of natural selection. Based on these beliefs, many southern states passed legislation forbidding the teaching of evolution in state-funded public schools. The American Civil Liberties Union convinced John Scopes, a public school teacher in Tennessee, to give a lesson on evolution, a topic that had been banned in Tennessee's public schools by the Butler Act. The case received national attention in both radio broadcasts and newspapers. The ACLU brought in Clarence Darrow, a famous Chicago lawyer, while the prosecution was assisted by former Democratic presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan. Scopes was convicted and fined $100, but the verdict was overturned on a technicality. The Butler Act was eventually upheld in Tennessee Supreme Court, but no other teacher was ever prosecuted for teaching evolution. New rights and new roles for women. Women finally gained the right to vote through the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Women's roles in the labor force also changed. Women found jobs as secretaries, sales clerks, telephone operators, nurses, and even factory workers. A small number of women even graduated from college, starting careers and asserting independence from men. Gone was the image of the traditional Victorian woman with her long braided hair, her tight corset, her broad hat, long dress, and perfect manners. The women of the 20s sought to emulate female movie stars and the assertive roles they played. Urban women wore lipstick, short hair, and simple dresses or skirts reaching to their knees. Young women often smoked and drank in public and even went out at night without a chaperone. These modern women were popularly known as flappers. Flappers enjoyed far greater freedom and self-expression than women before the war. Many opposed the flapper lifestyle and judged their behavior as immoral and sinful. Another matter that shocked traditionalists was the open discussion of birth control. Reformer Margaret Sanger began writing a series of articles about birth control in 1914. Fearing arrest, Sanger had to flee to England, but later returned, opening the first birth control clinic in the United States. A clinic ran exclusively by women. In 1921, Sanger started the American Birth Control League, a forerunner of Planned Parenthood. The Lost Generation. Young adults enjoyed greater freedom and comfort than previous generations. Their generation responded to the excessive materialism of their parents by joining a chaotic and tumultuous quest for pleasure. They were responsible for challenges such as goldfish swallowing, marathon dancing, and flagpole sitting. There was also a rise in popular heroes as a way to assert personal identity and individuality at a time when job conditions had become impersonal and products were standardized. Radio and motion pictures changed American lifestyles and greatly influenced national culture. Movie stars were role models for many, while others saw Hollywood as corrupt influence on the American public. Movie stars like Rudolph Valentino, Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Greta Garbo became household names. Other popular heroes of the time included baseball player Babe Ruth, boxing champion Jack Dempsey, and Charles Lindbergh, who made the first transatlantic flight in 1927. The writers of The Lost Generation rejected the materialism and superficiality of American life. Author F. Scott Fitzgerald portrayed the conflicts of his generation and the tragic outcomes of the search for material success in his famous novel, The Great Gatsby. Sinclair Lewis's novels criticized the hypocrisy of small-town American life, while Ernest Hemingway portrayed the lives of American and British expatriates in Europe in his 1926 novel, The Sun Also Rises.